In his dystopian novel 1984, George Orwell depicts a world in which political powers controlled everything. It was a totalitarian existence where even the history books were rewritten to conform to the approved political narrative. And though it is a novel, and it is a very good novel, it contains a couple of characters, a couple of people who, in their own small way, try to resist the juggernaut of of a politically controlled existence. Just a couple of characters who, in their own way, try to stand up against the tyranny of a controlled existence. Daniel and a handful of his friends had to navigate a real-world version of 1984. Babylon, the Babylonian Empire, in many respects, was a totalitarian empire. Everyone in spheres of influence had to think like the state, speak like the state, advance the worldview of the state. And Daniel, along with a handful of his friends, were swallowed up into that empire, and they were pressured to conform. That is Daniel chapter 1. The immensity of the pressure to conform to the state. So the question is, how would Daniel navigate life in that empire with fidelity to God while entrusting himself to God? By way of application, we're going to ask ourselves, how would we, Christians, navigate the ungodly empire we currently find ourselves in with fidelity to God while entrusting ourselves to God? To answer this, we do need to discover three things. We need to discover three things in the text. We need to discover the ungodliness of the empire in which Daniel lived. We need to discover how Daniel walked in fidelity or allegiance or loyalty to God. And we need to discover how entrusting ourselves to God, even in a difficult political climate, is the right thing to do. To entrust ourselves to God, even in dark days, is the right thing to do. Let's begin by thinking about the ungodly world in which Daniel and his faithful friends found themselves. And a good place to start thinking about the ungodliness of the empire is to think about the kinds of people that Nebuchadnezzar singled out to be future leaders of his empire. When Nebuchadnezzar looks out and thinks about his empire, and he thinks about who would lead them in the future, these are the people that he chooses. In verse 3, Nebuchadnezzar commanded Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. Future leaders were not only to be in good physical shape, they also had to show a capacity for leadership. But how is Nebuchadnezzar going to get his wish? I mean, finding the good-looking people is probably the easy part, but how do you get the good-looking people to be politically useful to the empire? How do you make them useful to an empire? Well, you indoctrinate the candidates. That's how you do it. You indoctrinate the candidates. You sit them down for years on end in a state-controlled educational program. That's how you get compliance from your population. Verses 4 and 5 tell us Daniel and his classmates were to learn the literature and the language of the Chaldeans in a 3-year intensive at the finest school in the empire. It's the kind of school that would set you up for life. It was that kind of school. And let's be honest. If you had just been forcibly evicted from your ancestral homeland, like Daniel and his faithful friends were, that would have been a pretty good gig to fall into, wouldn't it? A prestigious school, full scholarship, the best lecturers, and the kind of delicacies you and I could only but dream of, including the food that was set aside for the king. Not bad for a handful of kids, right, who only a few months ago lost everything that they once loved. Not a bad place to land when you've lost everything you once loved. But it comes at a price. The good life comes at a price. The good life wants something in return. There's a very old play called Faust, where some deeply dissatisfied character makes a deal with the devil. The devil offers him unlimited knowledge, pleasure, and power in exchange for his soul. You can have it all in exchange for your soul. You can have the good life, but the good life can be personally costly. Look at the personal costs imposed on Daniel and his classmates. Verse 6 and 7. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. At a glance, we probably might miss the point. Their headmaster, this eunuch, is a loyalist to all things Babylon. And he wants his students immersed fully in the Babylonian system. He wants them immersed in the Babylonian arts, in the Babylonian literature, in the Babylonian philosophy, in the Babylonian foods. He wanted those boys from Judah to become Babylonian. He wants the boys from Judah to become Babylonian. All the way down to the very core of their being. He wants their identity to become Babylonian. That they would think of themselves no longer as the kids from Judah, but as children of Babylon. And for this reason, they were given Babylonian names. They have their Jewish names taken and exchanged with Babylonian names. Because naming is an act of erasing that old Jewish identity and their connection to their Old Testament church. This is deliberate. This isn't just so that it would be easier on people's tongues to name their names. No, this is to replace their identity. This is to make them fully Babylonian. In some respects, this is the difficulty many of us have faced or are facing, especially our young people. The world we grow up in offers the potential for success, and that in itself is not a bad thing. Success is not the enemy, but it offers success looking to extract a hidden personal cost. Your identity, your connection to the church community. Young people, you may be told that you can have the career path you desire as long as you keep that Christian stuff to yourself and out of the workplace. Better yet, you can have the career path you desire, but why don't you just go ahead and drop that Christian stuff altogether? Become like the rest of us, agnostic, progressive, disinterested in religious conversations. Young people, you need to know this kind of pressure is real and could come your way. It is real and it could come your way. Perhaps in a job interview, perhaps in a commitment to sports or theater or social life. Somewhere, the pressure to choose between faith and advancing your options will be crystal clear to you. The pressure will come. To handle pressure like this, it is often helpful to know a few hero stories, isn't it? It's helpful to know that other people have walked that same path, have faced a similar pressure, and have come out the other side intact. I find it helpful to know stories like that when pressure comes, when pressure to compromise comes. It's helpful to know that others went through the same thing and gave us an example to follow. One such example I have in mind is the story of a man named John Lennox. He might not sound familiar to many of you. John Lennox is a mathematics professor at Oxford University, prestigious university. And he is an intellectually gifted man. He recounts a time when, as a young, aspiring academic, he was hauled into an office with a handful of higher-ups and other professors. They knew he was a Christian. One of them asked him, and this is words from Lennox himself, "Lennox, do you want to make a career in science?" John Lennox said, "Yes, sir. Very much so." Well, in front of these witnesses, right now, give up this childish belief in God. It will cripple you intellectually. You'll never make it. You look worse than everybody else, and if you want to look as good as everybody else, you will give it up right now. Imagine that. Imagine being hauled into an office like that as an aspiring career academic and being told to give up your faith if you want to proceed. Terrified and quickly praying, Lennox said he mustered a prayer and he answered, "Sir, what have you got to offer that is better than what I already got?" And after a bit of back and forth, Lennox said, "Sir, with respect, if that's all you've got, I'll take the risk and stick with what I've got." And that's the end of that conversation. But what a crazy thing to have experienced, right? To be hauled in and told, if you want a future in this career path, right now, give up that silly nonsense about God. I'm thankful for the way that the Lord enabled Dr. Lennox to respond with integrity in a situation like that. What became of his intimidators, I'll never know, but I do know this, that Dr. Lennox maintained a distinguished career in the sciences without sacrificing his faith. Young people, you need to know real-life stories like this to help you know you don't have to compromise your faith to succeed. You don't have to. Well, Daniel faced a similar intimidating crosspoint, didn't he? The offer of future success was tabled, and he actually had very little say in whether he accepts that offer or not, since he was the subject of Babylonian rule. If he said, no, I don't want to go to this school, he might have lost his head for defying the king. So how will Daniel navigate life in that empire with fidelity to God? How will he do it? How will he live in a hostile culture with faithfulness, with loyalty, with allegiance to God? Look at verse 8 with me. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. This really is the key verse to the chapter. Facing a tsunami of Babylonian attempts to erase and eradicate all traces of fidelity to God, Daniel resolved not to defile himself. Note that. Daniel resolved not to defile himself. If you hear nothing else this morning, please hear this. We often fantasize that we will be that person who makes a stand for God when the time comes. We fantasize that we will be that lone spectator in the crowd, the one and only who will not salute Hitler. Let me suggest to you, that moment of heroism will pass you by unless you resolve in the years, in the months, in the hours before that moment arrives, not to defile yourself. You have to settle that conviction beforehand. You have to know which lines you will not cross before you get to those lines. And note, Daniel's settled conviction immediately propels him to action. Straight away, he asks the headmaster, the eunuch in charge, with whom he must have been on a good speaking relationship, right, or good speaking terms, for an exemption not to eat the king's food or drink the king's wine. Now look, I know there are people who make a big deal of this food and wine thing, as though it is more virtuous to eat a vegetarian diet and not to drink wine. Let me just say, just very briefly, verse 8 is not prescriptive of a more virtuous biblical diet. It is only descriptive of what Daniel did. It is not telling you what you should do. It's just letting us know what Daniel did. But it still begs the question, why? Why make a stand here against the eating of the meat and the drinking of the good wine? Why make the stand here and not on some other point? Let me suggest to you, in his own way, Daniel was figuring out how to be a witness in an empire unconcerned with his God. He's trying to figure out, how am I going to be a witness for my God in an empire who does not care about my God? And figuring that kind of thing out is difficult, isn't it? To retain a sense of identity as a believer, a person who lives in reference to God, and how to proceed with witnessing to a world that has no place or time for your God. How would you do it if you were Daniel? Where would you begin? Think on Daniel's witness for a minute. Daniel was willing to put up with an awful lot from his state. He was willing to put up with his state education. He was willing to put up with his new state name. He was willing to work his state job in the future as a civic leader. He's even on good terms with his headmaster, who wanted Daniel fully assimilated into Babylonian life. Daniel and his headmaster were able to have a conversation. Daniel was even able to ask an extraordinary favor from that man. What does that tell you about Daniel? It tells me that Daniel wasn't brash or an obnoxious person to be around, even for an unbeliever like the headmaster. That they could be on good speaking terms, they could converse, and Daniel could even ask an extraordinary favor from him. And that tells us a great deal about being a witness in an empire unconcerned with God. Like Daniel, we could be encouraged to be the kind of person who does not put an unbeliever's nose out of joint every time we open our mouths. Daniel knew this. Even the apostle in the Roman world knew that this was a good tactic for Christians to employ. The apostle said the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. Yet equally we know that Daniel's demeanor, his ability to have a conversation with an unbeliever without being a jerk, we know that that kind of stance that he took does not mean that Daniel lacked conviction about his faith. He's not watering down anything here. He's just not being an egg. Right? But his faith and his conviction about God is as solid as ever. He was willing to be a witness and to go public with his faith. And this is where I think the question about his dietary choice is actually answered. Why did Daniel give up that food? I think it's a way for him to show his headmaster his faith in action. He could have chosen a different hill to die on. He chose this one. He chose to show his headmaster his faith in action by giving up the choicest of the food. In verses 12 to 13, when he's alleviating the headmaster's concern that they're going to wither away if they turn vegetarian, Daniel said, "Test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see." For Daniel, this is just an inroad, isn't it? It's an inroad, a way to be a witness in an empire that is unconcerned with his God. A choice to live differently in some measurable and observable way, when it would have been far easier for Daniel to simply fit in, to simply say, "Yep, I'll eat whatever you put in front of me. I'll do what everybody else does." That's so often the beginning of a good public witness in a culture that is unconcerned with God. Our witness begins with the resolve not to defile ourselves, not to be, not to live, to entertain and to spend and to compromise and to assimilate like everybody else. And then act on that resolve, on that conviction in demonstrable ways. Have the conviction, act on the conviction, and then entrust the outcome to God. Have the conviction, act on the conviction, and entrust the outcome to God. And this is what I want to turn our thoughts to now. Daniel and his friends had the difficult task of navigating that ungodly empire with some discernible fidelity and loyalty and allegiance to God, and then they would have to entrust the outcome to God. We might well ask the same question. Are we able to navigate our ungodly world with fidelity to God, all the while entrusting the outcome to Him? I think we could. I really do think we could, if we bring to mind what Daniel knew about God. Some fundamental things that Daniel knew about God. Firstly, if you remember in verse 2, Daniel was aware that his exile and his hard season of life was no indication of God's absence or delinquency. Rather, it was God who ultimately gave Daniel and his people to Babylon. It was God who gave them to the Babylonian Empire. But as the chapter goes on, we see God's hand in all other kinds of details as well. In verse 9, God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And you go to verse 17 and we see God's hand once more. As for these youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. In the giving of the exile, in the giving of favor, in the giving of learning and skill and understanding, God is unmistakably there. And because God involves Himself even in the details, Daniel and his friends were able to entrust the outcome of their witness to God. God is there, so they are able to entrust themselves to Him. And this frees them to live faithfully, free to do the next faithful thing, free to stand before King Nebuchadnezzar and all his political power as those who really stood under the gaze and love of their God, who has absolute power, and yet the kind of God who pays attention to the smallest of details. This chapter offers us a number of lessons, and I focused on just 3 of them. How would we navigate the ungodly empire we currently find ourselves in with fidelity to God, while we entrust ourselves and the outcome of our witness to God? First, we must discover that an ungodly empire is one which attempts to push God out to the margins, if not out of mind altogether. And it does so frequently by pressuring believers, just like Nebuchadnezzar's empire pressured Daniel and his faithful friends to give up their identity as believers in God. Secondly, we engage that world with fidelity to God. We do so by taking one small step of faithfulness at a time. One small step of faithfulness at a time. Find a corner to start in. Just find a corner. Begin somewhere. Resolve to live differently in some measurable and observable way to the glory of God. So that when people ask you, hey, why do you live differently? Why don't you subscribe to all the subscription TV stations like everyone else? Why don't you eat the king's food? You can tell them of the hope of glory, of the gospel of Jesus, of sin forgiven, and the warm welcome of God. Just find a corner to start in. It doesn't have to be that corner. It doesn't have to be the cancellation of Netflix. It might be for you, but just find a corner and make a start to live differently in the empire. Lastly, for all our alertness to the ungodly world and all our attempts at living with fidelity to God, we do so entrusting ourselves to the God who is with us, entrusting ourselves to the God who is there, as Francis Schaeffer coined the phrase. He is the one who, as Daniel would later testify, the God who changes times and seasons, the God who removes kings and sets up kings. So I close by asking, are you willing to trust him also in this season we find ourselves in? If you're a young person, are you willing to resolve in your youth, as Daniel did, not to defile yourself with the good life at the cost of your identity as a believer in God? Are you today willing to make that kind of resolve? This, after all, is the basis of Christian life, isn't it? Entrusting ourselves to God. This is so fundamental to the Christian life, to entrust ourselves to God. Jesus himself said, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." It is the invitation to entrust yourself to Christ, who speaks the words of truth. Let me pray for us.